Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo. I'm the founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency public sector advisory firm that's focused on helping Africa solve its complex development challenges. And in examining Africa's development trajectory, one theme recurs with kind of striking consistency, and it's the centrality of public institutions as the primary engine of societal transformation. Across the continent, these institutions constitute the core architecture through which collective aspirations are translated into policy, public goods, and long-term development outcomes. Yet, at the margins, many of these institutions remain persistently ineffective, constrained by structural deficiencies, capacity gaps, incentive misalignments, and the cumulative weight of political and economic distortions. The consequences are chronic divergence between policy intent and development impact. At this moment of quite profound national strain, Nigeria's institutional fragilities demand not merely critique, but a rigorous intellectual, theoretical, and practical interrogation to understand what ails us, the configuration of leadership, systems and incentives required to restore the coherence and effectiveness, and how a deeper understanding of institutional functionality may ultimately illuminate pathways for national renewal. It is against this backdrop that today's conversation takes a particular urgency. My guest today, Dr. Dakuku Peterside, has a quite unique combination of being a student leader, a politician, a scholar. He's been involved through the years as a students' union leader, editor of a student's paper, special assistant to a governor, chairman of a local government council, commissioner for works, and a member of Nigeria's House of Representatives. In 2015, he had an unsuccessful run for governor of Rivers State and was subsequently appointed as Director General of a federal parastatal, NIMASA. He has chronicled his lessons in several books, and one of the books is Strategic Turnaround Story of a Government Agency. Last month, he gifted us two new books, Leading in a Storm, Practical Leadership Strategies in Crisis Situations, and Beneath the Surface, essays. It's a compilation of his essays over the last, between 2020 and 2025, and it's Beneath the Surface, essays on Nigeria's checkered journey. I'm delighted to have him with us today to help us unpack the several challenges and opportunities shaping Nigeria's development journey. Dakuku, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. Truly, it is my pleasure and I consider it an honor to be on your platform. I've participated in a number of these conversations, and I must confess, each time I leave enriched in knowledge. So it is another opportunity today, this time, to participate in the conversation.
No, fantastic. The pleasure is ours. And let's start by examining, some of the dominant narratives about African institutions, right? So, for example, Manko Olsen, his concept of institutional sclerosis, that suggests that interest groups and rent-seeking coalitions, tend to build up over time and resist change in these public institutions. Yeah, Acemoglu and Robinson describe African institutions as being neo-patrimonial, leading to extractive institutions. From your street level hands-on experience at NIMASA, to what extent do these theories explain our institutions' inability to deliver impact? Or are they merely convenient excuses that we've accepted? Are there other variables from your experience, maybe such as sheer incompetence or poor incentive structures that better explain for us the challenges that we have compared to what all these theories tend to postulate?
Thank you very much. You cannot, in all honesty, dismiss these theoretical underpinnings. They actually find expression in most of our institutions and institutional contexts. Now, what has happened, or if you observe, it has to do with three things. One is the foundation of these institutions. Very often, what we try to do is to replicate institutions in other countries, predominantly in the West and in America. Replicate it in African context that is totally different, culturally different from the places where these institutions were copied from. That's one. Two, the second one is the clear case of lack of capacity. This is prevalent in almost all African institutions, almost all African institutions. Clear case of lack of capacity. Now, the third thing you may have also observed is that these institutions end up being captured by not just rent seekers, by our patrons, those who benefit from the inefficiency of the system. Now, there is no incentive for the institutions to either reform or even function efficiently. And so each of these theoretical underpinnings find absolute expression in our institutions. You can see manifestation of all of this in our institutions. So to that extent, they are right and they are relevant.
Yeah, but it appears to me, because if you look at it, Jeffrey Sachs will situate his own on geography and maybe disease burden. You talk to Acemoglu, it's on institutions. You talk to the dependency theorists, they'll situate it around our colonial heritage and so on. In fact, Ali Maziril, if you remember the documentary we watched growing up, the triple heritage, he places it on colonialism, religion, and our Africanness. My question is, when I look at all of this and I've read the books and I understand them, it appears to me like that story of the 12 blind men trying to describe an elephant, yeah? And that we as scholars, we as public intellectuals have not gone through the pain of kind of codifying or articulating from our own lived experiences what are the fundamental issues. And here I'm looking at when you got to NIMASA and you knew that you had to transform a moribund institution with all of these factors, religion, ethnicity, capacity, etc. In your experience, what is that fundamental reason why the institution did not work? And what is it that made the institution work after your 4 years?
Thank you very much. Let's even start from Ashimogu's postulation about geopolitical factors. Now, recall that he observed, if you recall very well, that in America, because the institutions work, it became an incentive for people to be productive. In Mexico, sharing the same geographical region with the United States.
Border.
The same border. Now, institutions don't work, and it became a disincentive for people to be productive. Now, it also became an incentive for rent seeking. And so, he followed up with what happened in Haiti and Dominican Republic. They share the same district. And his conclusion is that geography alone cannot explain the difference in institutional context, institutional functionality, and efficiency of institutions. So to that extent, I agree that geography alone cannot explain the differences in institutions. Now, recall this guy also talked about our colonial heritage, and I have mentioned earlier that most of our leaders transpose institutions from foreign territories, impose them on our territory without considering the context. And that's a challenge because the African context is different, the African culture is different, the incentive to perform in Africa is different. It also speaks to our current level of growth. Now, those has to do with theory, or have to do with theory. Now, back to NIMASA. What I realized when I arrived at NIMASA, NIMASA's case was very peculiar. One, it's the regulatory organization. Two, even the operatives misunderstood the functions, the mandate of NIMASA. That's some challenge that speaks to the issue of lack of capacity. And so when you get people to run organizations, to lead organizations for which they don't understand the mandate, they don't understand the framework, they don't understand the culture, the kind of results we had in NIMASA is what you are going to have. They had a reputational problem, they had capacity gap, they had fundamental challenge in the framework. What we tried to do was first address the issue of reputation. And to address the issue of reputation on a sustainable basis, we have to deal with internal culture. To deal with internal culture, we have to build capacity. To build capacity means that we have to do things differently. There needs to be a new kind of framework, a new orientation. And as leaders, we must model what we want from them. We made it very clear that institutions are critical to prosperity of nations, not just prosperity of nations, even stability of nations. And that if we don't have the right institutions, then we can't guarantee growth. We can't even guarantee stability. Progress will be impeded. And when institutions are not resilient, then we'll just keep running ourselves. Those were the foundational things we did in our own instance in NIMASA. We realized that we didn't have a problem with geography. We didn't have a problem with the people. We simply needed to build their capacity. And that we were dealing with entities across borders. We needed to get our reputation fixed. And the other thing we realized is that our mandate is citizen-centered. Our primary mandate is to protect the interests of Nigerian citizens, not to protect the interests of patrons. I understand. I clearly appreciate that you understand the two different factors. Now, the other issue is we need a culture of transparency and accountability, knowing that we'll be held to account for the mandate we have. Like I've always said, the power we exercise, the power of Nigerian people given to us through the national parliament is not because we're the most powerful in the land. It's simply because the Nigerian people donated that power to us through the national parliament, the act of the national parliament. Now we're given power to protect the interest of the Nigerian people. So our actions have to be citizen-driven, driven by citizen interest. We have to show transparency. We've got to be accountable to the powers of the society, the mandate of the society. We've got to build the capacity of our people. Those are the critical elements.
Okay, so let me build on that point a little bit. In most analysis around Nigeria's future, Nigeria's performance, etc., one of the key points that always comes to the fore is the role of corruption. And especially an institution like NIMASA and all other federal institutions, etc. In your experience, if you were to rank corruption against capacity, which would you say was the bigger, more dominant challenge that we need to address in our public institutions? We know that both of them are important, but how do you rank corruption and capacity?
I will rank lack of capacity higher than corruption. Now, if you address lack of capacity, you have dealt with corruption substantially. But if you deal with the issue of corruption and you have lack of capacity, all institutions will remain inefficient. And so, can we deal with the issue of capacity? If we deal with the issue of capacity, we have substantially addressed the issue of corruption. Now, when you talk about capacity, it is multidimensional, not just competence.
Exactly.
Because if you look at it through the narrow prism of competence, then we'll get it wrong. Capacity is multidimensional, including what kind of ethical orientation public servants should have. Now, like I always point out, 3 critical things. One is citizen-oriented leadership, meaning that we should know that legitimacy is not assumed. We should also understand that long-term sustainability depends on the actors, not necessarily the framework, the law. The framework is important, but sustainability also depends on capacity. Now, the second pillar is the fact that we have to be strategic and adaptive in building capacity. Where do we want to go in the long run? What kind of adaptive capacity do we need to build? Now, what kind of ethical orientation? What kind of transformative mindset do we need to build in our public servants? And so when we say capacity, I want us to look at it from a broader perspective, not from a narrow prism.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And let's dig a bit deeper on these reform issues and seek to understand reform within the African context. In your book, you wrote about changing organizational culture at NIMASA through new work ethics, which you have hinted to in your responses, having a vision statement that galvanizes the organization, knowledge transfer sessions to improve capacity, etc. But it appears to me that these factors kind of tick all the right boxes according to the standard social science and transformational literature that's out there. However, the French scholar Pierre Bourdieu, reminds us that societies reproduce themselves through the behaviors they reward, right? So my question is really about, how the behavior of the Director General of a government agency could communicate more or drive reforms more than a vision statement, or how the way a governor, a president carries himself can galvanize a nation, more than a lot of the things we say. And on the back of that, what kind of reward structures or incentives, did you institute to excite transformation within NIMASA? And how did that deliver the impact that you hoped for?
All right, thank you very much. Now, you call it a reward system, and I want to call it the incentive system. Now, what will make a civil servant or a public servant choose transparency and accountability over corruption? How do I situate this in the context of NIMASA? When I got to NIMASA, I realized that the incentive system encourages corruption. And I needed to tweak that to change that culture. To change that culture, I started with diagnostics of what is actually wrong with the current incentive system. Promotion at the time was not based on any standard. We changed that. And that is basic, very primary. Now, promotion, we instituted 2 different things that changed. One is that you have to write exams periodically to be qualified to be promoted. Now, the other thing is that the second thing we introduced has to do with conduct, character, behavior, which has nothing to do with quantitative measures of I scored 18 an exam or this. Now, this appraisal, the appraisal system, is not annual, it's quarterly, but it builds up to an annual appraisal system. You are not only appraised by your direct boss, you were appraised through a system. At the time we got the PhD to participate in the appraisal system, that was a place in framework for appraisal. And so you could do well in a promotion exam, but your appraisal shows that you're not ready to progress to the next level. Now, that was a change of the incentive system. Now, the second thing we introduced was public affirmation. Now, how does that work? We rewarded honest acts, we rewarded efficiency, we rewarded appropriate communication, and we put in place a framework for assessing every staff every month. And so we had staff of the month for every department, staff of the month for the agency-wide. So every month we had staff of the month in every department. And it was not determined by any written exam. It was determined by an agreed framework that speaks to your character, your conduct, your honesty, the transparency, your efficiency. Traits. We identified 12 traits. That was a second level initiative to change the incentive system. So we celebrated now, we know that in motivation science, we are taught that there are intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. We celebrated these public servants publicly every month for good conduct, for efficiency. The idea was to reinforce acceptable conduct and punish what is not acceptable.
Two questions for you. Two questions. How did you?
I'm waiting to take the 2 questions.
How did you get around, allegations of favoritism, ethnic considerations, religious considerations? And the second question is, how did you then? Because I assume that you remunerated better. How did you find money to remunerate better, and how did that fit within the civil service code?
All right, so 2 questions. The first one, how do you go around ethnic, regional bias and all of those things?
Yes.
Now, 2 things that we did with that. One, the fact that we hired an external consulting firm that designed the framework and implemented this framework alongside the public servants.
Fantastic.
Reasonably or significantly reduced the allegation of bias. Framework was done. How you are being assessed? No. Assessors? No, based on specific framework. And so we did not only just hire the PhD, we all looked at the framework, agreed on the framework. Implementation, we had a committee. The committee sits with KPMG every single month to assess staff. And so we eliminated the incidents and allegation of bias by getting trusted third-party independent facilitator.
Yes.
The other one was a clear framework that is known by all parties. And so we never dealt with the issue of allegation of ethnic bias, religious bias, region bias, whatever bias. So to that extent, that's one of the things. The fact that we got an independent party assessor. The second thing we did was to publish how we arrived at the decision. So transparency.
Fantastic.
So it's not just having an independent decision. You explain how you arrive at the start of the month in your department, how you arrive at the start of the month at the agency level. So everything is published. And say, oh, these were the qualities exhibited. These were the traits exhibited. These were the special acts performed. And we communicated more effectively. That's another thing. That's another challenge I realized. The issue of communication. And so if you ask me, three things. One, independent assessors. Build the capacity of your people to understand it, to implement it. The second thing was the fact that we were very transparent and made public every single yardstick, how we arrive at our decisions. The third is the fact that we also submitted these things to review. People had right to complain, to raise issues. And we're lucky, we never had anybody raising issues because we're so transparent. And in the process.
How did you get money to pay? Within the restrictions of, yeah.
Now, on the issue of pay, let me confess, by the time I arrived in NIMASA, I realized that their pay was slightly better than a typical civil servant. The issue is that the point they made was the fact that they regulate those who are in shipping. Shipping is a high-end business. You cannot be a regulator and go back behind begging. You must live at certain levels, like regulated oil and gas industry. We couldn't compete with shipping companies, but at least let's get our people to some level where they can have the confidence. The regulator protects society, not protect the shipping company. His primary responsibility as a regulator is to protect harm done by shipping companies to society, protect national interest, protect citizens' interest first, national interest second. And so they needed to be properly enumerated competitively so that the shipping companies don't poach the best amongst us and don't compromise the best in the system. And so we engaged with all institutions of government and they truly understood our perspective. And so we had a different incentive system from the typical public service system.
Okay, excellent. Now let's explore another issue that always comes up when we talk about transforming public sector institutions, and it's that patronage performance trade-off. So yes, you significantly increased NIMASA's revenue remittances and achieved about 33% increase in Nigeria-owned vessels, as well as corresponding increase in, jobs created in the sector. However, you also probably had to navigate the political realities of working within the Buhari administration and also maybe your relationship with the then transport minister, Rotimi Amechi. How did you manage to navigate patronage expectations? And I'm, trying to put a technical coloration on, what is really patronage corruption? Is there a theoretical framework for this, or was it all improvisation on your part? How did you manage that?
All right, thank you very much. I like to put it this way. Political interference is a constant feature in public institutions. The desire for patronage is a constant feature. Now, there are many things, if you ask me. The first thing is if you understand your mandate. The second is that you have to be very clear about what your priorities are. The third, and the most important, is actually communication. It's critical. Communication and trust building. I like to speak to the issue of communication. And I extend communication to stakeholder engagement. When I arrived in NIMASA, the then transport minister didn't quite have a full grasp of the functions of NIMASA, there is a regulatory agency. As part of broader stakeholder management and consultation, I sat with him and patiently explain our role as that of regulatory. We are not an operational agency. NIMASA does not own vessels in the same way shipping companies own vessels. We are simply a regulator. We set standards, enforce rules, enforce regulations, enforce laws. That's our primary responsibility. The secondary responsibility, because of the addition of the carbon tax, is to also promote participation of Nigerians in shipping and for Nigerians to get involved in the industry. So as part of broader stakeholder engagement, I sat with him. As for Mr. President, then President Buhari, we also had that level of engagement. And even for the shipping companies, they had the erroneous impression that as government agency will simply make funds available for them to go acquire vessels and compete with other players globally. For me, one thing is critical in managing stakeholders. It is the fact that you must engage at a granular level. Let everybody understand your mandate, your objective, your priorities, your motivations. It is important. And so whether in running of an agency, embarking on a reform, communication is critical. Now, targeted priorities and objectives are also important. Listen, this is where we are as a country. This is where we want to be. And to move from here to here, we need to do things differently. That is critical. Now, the other thing is that on the issue of corruption, let me publicly say, I was wrong. The corruption didn't come from the push for corruption didn't come from the highest level of government. I will not be honest if I say I never had any pressure from the presidency to do anything silly. I had never had any pressure from the then Minister of Transport to do anything silly. And so if I was under pressure, it was from other stakeholders. And so once it was clear to me that the appointing authority had zero tolerance for corruption, I was emboldened to enforce anti-corruption measures. And no living human being will ever say that throughout my time in NIMASA, I discussed bribery and corruption with him and challenge anybody. Why and how? Not only that it's a character I've developed over time, I was further emboldened by the fact that at the level of the presidency and at the level of the Minister of Transport, there was no push to compromise values, to get corrupt. But not many agencies of government are that lucky. And so it is important, the way the behavior model and ethics of government influences what happens down the line. So when a governmental system is corrupt, please check out what is going on from the ethics. It cascades down. Everybody just corrupt in the system.
Where do you... Yeah, go ahead.
When you observe a trend of corruption among agencies, look at the supervisory ministries and look at the level of the presidency. You will trace corruption along the line.
Interesting.
One thing that model certain conduct, certain behavior, everybody or most officials will fall in line. It is important as leaders that we model the kind of things we want to see throughout the agencies. It is very, very critical.
Let me ask another variation of that question, because corruption is, really a big problem that we need to address. And in practice here, you could have, maybe a director, a PAMSEC or something in the ministry who, as you and I know, even if you passed your your promotion exam, there is still, as I have been told and as I have seen, an expectation that one greases the wheels, to get that promotion, right? And sometimes these directors or PAMSECs have to take out loans to pay the bribes to get into those positions. And the expectation is that when they get into office, they would find a way to recoup that investment and pay. So whilst the pressure for you may not have come from the presidency or from the minister, there could have been pressure within the organization of people who have extended themselves financially and need to recoup that investment. Was that a situation in your instance, and how did you manage that?
All right, thank you. I am quite aware of this, and I'd like to tell you what we did differently in NIMASA.
Yeah.
The first is the issue of promotion exam, because we are specific in context, and that's why I want to address it from a specific context. If I will address it from a broader perspective, but let me be specific. When I got to NIMASA, and I realized that if we set our exams internally, a lot of persons could be compromised. We brought consulting outfits. One was ASCON, the Administrative Staff College of Nigeria, and I've got the name of the second consulting outfit. And so we made it a 3-layer thing. And so ASCON will set one set of questions, the second consulting outfit will set another set of questions. And there was a particular one, most staff with NIMASA didn't like, and we can verify it, what was called the digits questions. I did a setting of the questions. Now you have 3 sets of questions to deal with. And these things are marked by 3 different entities. Consultant number 1, consultant number 2, and the DG. This is not something that is obtainable in other agencies. But I just share with you how we address that peculiar challenge. And so you get ASCON accessory, you get the second consulting outfit accessory, you get the DG accessory. Now all of this constitutes 60% of your assessment. There's a continuous assessment that will constitute 40%. Now, it's possible you might compromise ASCON. It's not possible, it may not likely, it's not most likely, not probable, that you can succeed in compromising the second person or compromise the DG. If you choose to compromise the DG, if it's so stupid that you choose to compromise it, ASCON may not be very easy for you to compromise ASCON or the second entity. And so we had a 3-pronged approach to written examination. That was one way of dealing with that. And over time, people realize that they simply just need to go, get knowledge, train themselves, get better to navigate all of these complexities. That's exactly one way we dealt with that. Now, what of the issue of a continuous assessment? Now, you are assessed by your direct boss with a given framework. Now, whatever assessment done by you is now verified by an independent entity. They verify it. They may agree with your list, they may not agree, they may ask for a repeat of your assessment. Then there's an very different entity that brings all these assessments together. It may appear cumbersome, but it was a way of addressing the issue of corruption in the process. And indeed, it became a disincentive for people to attempt to corrupt. They know that you will get to know with it. You can't compromise all of these entities to achieve a single objective. You better face it. That was one way we addressed it in NIMASA. And this is verifiable. And it worked. And I think that template, they continued for a while. I don't know what must have happened. They continued for a while with the template. And most public officials got promoted purely on merit.
Exactly. And we're going to come back to sustainability question, but let me, stay on this for one more question, which is, how do you manage reform losers? So in every transformation, in every reform, some people would lose, especially status quo, folks in the status quo. So who lost in your reform efforts? How did you manage the resistance, which I'm sure that they put forward, once they realize that they're going to lose out? How did you manage the inevitable resistance, which would come? And, what's the theoretical literature, if any, in change management that helped you to navigate that process?
All right. Thank you very much. Like you said, there will always be losers. Those who benefit from the current system will resist reforms. They will not only resist reforms, they will fight reforms. They will come with narratives that counter everything reforms represents. Now, one way to deal with this is to build a community of change agents. Those who believe in the reforms, create a critical mass, build a critical mass. It is absolutely very important. Build a critical mass of those who believe in reforms. Now they become vanguards for advancing reforms, embedding or sustaining reforms. Now the other thing is that celebrate small wins. Every progress with reforms, celebrate it. Let people understand the tangible benefits. And every reformer must have courage. If you don't have courage, you can't even embark in reform, because change is not a sprint, it is a marathon.
Exactly.
And so you must build a community of change agents who will work with you, a critical mass that will work with you. Then you must communicate the benefits. And whatever, reform is iterative. It's not a light switch on and off. With reforms, you make progress incrementally. Every small progress celebrated. Now, one of the things we try to do in NIMASA was to automate the processes. Whether it is procurement process, whether it's licensing process, whether approval of, and that was heavily resisted. We created multiple committees. Now, those committees was not essentially because they are going to be drivers. It was different platforms to get them to understand what the reform is all about, get their buy-in, and get them to be at the driver's seat of the reforms. We were actually mobilizing a critical mass to support the reforms. We were driving, and it worked. And for the losers, if they understand with time, because you just have to get away to make them minority elements in the system. And if they understand that over time the system will not tolerate them, they will either adjust or they will show the way out. And we have a way of showing them the way out. So resistance is very normal in any reform system.
Fantastic. In Nigeria, one of the challenges we face is this well-intentioned idea of federal character, but has become like an albatross, on all of us. How did you deal with that? Because I feel that it's difficult to drive a really merit-based, reform process if one then has to balance on ethnically, educationally disadvantaged, or any of those, appellations that we use to justify subpar behavior. So how did you interact with this? How did you, not fall short of the Federal Character Commission provisions whilst trying to build a merit-based system within a federal government?
Now, you must find a balance between idealism and an objective system. You must find a delicate balance. And I'll share with you what we did in NIMASA. This was well captured in Strategic Turnaround, in my earlier book, Strategic Turnaround. Now, at some point, we had vacancies for 12 directors. There were existing directors, and so there were about 6 or 7 vacancies. And we wanted only the best to be directors, because they actually are leaders of the organization. The other ones are political leaders. The real leaders, of the government agency are the highest level civil servants. The political leaders simply just go through a 4-year cycle. And so if you don't have the right caliber of persons, or those with the right culture as directors, as general managers, then there's no way reforms can be sustainable. So we put them through an exam, interview, series of interviews. I've made it clear that for every geopolitical zone to have a seat at what was called at the directorate cadre, there were minimum conditions you meet. If you don't even meet those conditions, you can't even sit for the exams. So anyway, when you sit for the exams, if there's only one person from the southwest, and this is hypothetically speaking, I want us to get it clear, and he's not able to score 60, unfortunately, he can't get a seat. However, if there were 10 persons from the southeast who can populate all the directorates with people from the southeast, so the two highest persons will naturally get promoted and the others will get promoted. So even if they score 90, 90, 90, 90, 90, everybody from the northwest scores 60, 60, 60. Unless nobody from the northwest scores above 60, then unfortunately you can't get promoted. So that was our own structured way of having a delicate balance. First, put a minimum condition and say everybody must meet the minimum condition. When you meet the minimum condition, then we'll now talk about geopolitical balance.
And that's fair. That's us Nigerians evolving our own system as we go along. There's a question that I've kind of struggled with, and I'm really interested in your answer to this question. So you rose through local government administration, state as commissioner for works, special advisor to governor, and then at the federal as a congressman in the Nigeria House of Reps. You rose through River State politics, and it is not, there are not a lot of choir boys, in River State politics. So you understand, or you grew up in a politics that understands patronage, that understands, how politics is done in Nigeria, interests, etc. And then you get to NIMASA and you're driving all of this transformation. How do you balance that? How do you balance accommodating elite interests that you must have built up in your career as you progressed, or else you wouldn't have gotten to the top, with this need to drive a clean, merit-based organization? Help me understand how that works.
All right, thank you very much. Now, for every leader, what matters is what you seek to accomplish. Early in my political career and in public life, I was clear in my mind what I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to simply be a leader of impact that will make a difference everywhere. When I was local government chairman, and I say this with sense of modesty, I knew that's not where I wanted to be. That was not the peak of what I wanted to be. I have to manage diverse interests. And managing diverse interests means that you must strike delicate balance. I've always said communication matters, intention matters, strategic priorities matters. Very important. Be open, be honest, be accountable. There are ways you can support any political leader without compromising the system. And it's important. Whether as local government chairman, and when I was commissioner for work, and when I was governor, then gave me free hand, and I mean free hand in the procurement process. And so if we're going to do any road, we very often will advertise and people will compete. And I can say with some sense of modesty, I never sat with anybody anywhere to fix contracts. We could get a competent contractor. I will now say this. Listen, this competent contractor, this political leader, all your subcontracts, give it to him where he's qualified. And we follow through. And that's when you have already secured the contract. Somebody will supply sand, somebody will supply cement. You will definitely give to somebody anyway. You have shown competence, you show capacity is taking a particular point. But you can't do everything yourself. Somebody will supply a cement. And we say, okay, good. Look at what this guy can do. See where you find him competent and where his praise is. Use it. So for me, if you ask me to summarize, I would say strength of character is one. Two is that if a leader is clear about his own intentions and objectives, the chances of compromising is slim. I've mentioned the first one, I don't want us to miss it. The fact of character. If you're a petty thief, difficult, you will always be a petty thief. People will see through that manipulation.
Fantastic.
They will see through. All those who walk around you will see through it. Now, the other one is, what is your strategic objective? What's your long-term objective? You simply want to participate in the patronage system, the corrupt system, to benefit for a long time. And of course, you just benefit. And over time, everybody will know that you're a corrupt leader. They will know, they will relate with you that way. And the other thing is that you have to be very open, transparent, and you are able to communicate effectively. Effective communication is key. And let what drives you be the interest of the citizens, not your own personal interest. If you don't live above your personal interest, the people will know and you will lose their trust.
Fantastic.
Trust is key.
Sure. And just to our participants, to say that in a few minutes, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Please type your questions in the Q&A tab. I will read from there, and I'll give full attribution to the person who posed the question. Q&A tab, not the comments section, because it's difficult for me to tease out the questions from all the discussions going on in the comment section. But let me push this, Dakuku, just maybe one more time. So there are the purists, who say, oh, okay, so there's the biblical verse, that says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and, give to Jesus what is Jesus's. And the purists will say that doesn't count, in managing public affairs. So cut no corners, just stick to purely merit. This is a company that can do the work, whether they know anyone or nothing, give it to them, etc. What I'm hearing you say is that the purists may be wrong, because if we work within a system, where there are political leaders who control certain, access and assets and so on, that you need to manage them. So, but the purists will say that once you start managing those interests, it's a slippery slope that you don't know where it's going to end. In practice, how do we manage this to ensure that we pay attention to what the purists are saying, but also do things that are pragmatic to move the country forward? And how has that played out in Nigeria? Because some might also argue that it's that trying to be pragmatic that has sustained corruption for so long.
Well, I agree to an extent. Let me be very clear what I mean. I believe in being pragmatic. Being pragmatic within an established framework of decision making. It is very, very important. Now, within the framework of, when I say within the framework of established decision making, if it is very clear that this is how we want to make a decision concerning an issue, please don't ever compromise it. Now, deal with the aftermath. Make that decision follow the rules and deal with the aftermath. That is being pragmatic. You didn't, and let's create an imaginary system. Everybody competes for a contract. One person will naturally win following the set down procedure. Debrief the other file why they didn't get it, and let them see that it's very transparent and that you're honest. You have dealt with 50% of the issues by simply putting in place a transparent decision-making process, a decision-making process that is fair, that is equitable. Now, let's also go to the theorist again. Ideally, once a decision is made, you don't even need to debrief anybody. However, there are gray areas in some. There's no system that establishes framework for making decisions on all issues. There are a lot of gray areas. Now, these gray areas. Now, mind you, corruption is not the failing of an individual only. It could be systemic. That an entire system has created structures that incentivize corruption. So, even as a leader, where you're morally upright, it could be that the system is designed to facilitate and incentivize corruption. And so you can't fight on all fronts at the same time. So as you deal with the gray areas, the most important thing, don't compromise on your own values. And as you deal with the system, find out how to reform the system in such a way that you can reasonably eliminate corruption.
Fantastic.
So this involves a lot of delicate balance.
Let me ask a question before I go to the Q&A tab on sustainability. You had alluded a bit on, you don't know if the systems you put in place are still working. There are other people like you who have found that done fantastic work when they were in office, and I engage with them 4 or 5 years afterwards, and they're like, okay, some of the things we put in place is not working, blah, blah, blah. Now that you've reflected on NIMASA, 5 years after, leaving NIMASA, what can you say about the sustainability plans you put in place? What has worked? What didn't work? If you could do it all over again, what would you do differently to ensure that those systems become impregnable, that they are there irrespective of who comes into power?
Yeah, one thing I realized with benefit of hindsight is that there are many things that we could have put. I don't want to say codified in laws. No, that's not. It's not everything that you can put in the books. But one thing is clear to me, that we could have documented more in 3 different, one, in the agency's handbook. We have what we call compendium of policies. The agency's handbook, the agency's law, the agency's bylaws. We could have documented more of the reforms. That's one thing we could have done differently. We started a culture change program. We didn't have sufficient time to embed the culture enough. Perhaps we could have started earlier. And so we could have been doing things, simultaneously. When we came, we realized that they had a terrible reputation. We tried to fix the reputation. We could have done the culture change. We could have started the culture change from day one. Where we started it, after 2 years down the line. And I don't think we embedded the new culture enough. Yes, we embedded the knowledge transfer section, which we introduced. We embedded the examination culture, the culture of going through an objective system to get promoted. We also institutionalized the reward system, the incentive system. We did that, but all of these things could have been better, captured either through laws, through regulations, through service handbook. we could have documented more, it would have been a lot more difficult for those who succeeded us to do otherwise. That's one thing we think that we could have done differently.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I have a question here from, Valentine Achum. He says, from Barack Obama's postulation, I understand that having strong men alone is an Achilles heel against institutional growth. However,
Yes.
strong institutions without people capacity and behavioral modifications cannot sustain the strength of our institutions. In fact, policies die on the altar of behavioral benightedness. So his question is, what would you say is the clear-cut pathway to driving a behavioral change approach to policy development and implementation for the sustainability of credible institutions that drive growth and development? And I know you've touched on some of them in our conversation. You actually laid out a step-by-step in the strategic transformation book, but if you can summarize the key pathway for transforming a public institution to ensure that it delivers results and remains sustainable.
All right, I'd like to share lessons from a lady called Ifoko, Omogre Okara. She was in an organization called Federal Inland Revenue Service, FIRS. Now, before her time, I don't think many Nigerians were very proud of the work of what is today known as Federal Inland Revenue Service. A lot of credit was given to her about the reforms we now see. It's been taken to the new level, hopefully with the latest round of reforms, where the reforms we see in Federal Inland Revenue Service. Now, she invested in 4 critical areas. One was capacity building. The second was that she introduced a new culture, and so she incentivized the right behavior and punished what was considered a wrong behavior. Now, the other thing is that she put in place a new performance management system, and finally, she put in place a culture of accountability. Now, if you notice, there are these shared similarities with what we did in NIMASA. We invested heavily in capacity building. We did not only invest in internal training, whether it's core knowledge transfer section, DG's house day section. We invested in capacity training around and in country, capacity training outside the country. That's one. So that's one thing. I've always said build capacity of the people in the agency. So even with the 4-year cycle of political leadership, nobody can take away that capacity. And so when a new political leadership comes, these guys have the confidence, to say no or yes, this works, this may not work, and they have the boldness because they understand, they have minded to understand what is the total of them. Now, the other one is the issue of culture. Culture has a way of driving strategy, incentivizing behavior. What is acceptable culture in the organization and what is not acceptable? Do we punish bad behavior and do we reward good behavior? Whether with the things we did in NIMASA and what Ifoko did in FIRS, they share a lot of similarities. Now that's called the second one. The third is the issue of performance management. I've discussed extensively. Now, when you know that your promotion is not tied to any single individual, it is tied to a system. It is the system that if you meet the threshold, you get promoted, whether anybody likes your face or not. You will be objective in your dealings. And then finally, the culture of accountability. For all our actions, accountability has nothing to do with finances only. It has to do with our conduct, our performance. how we relate with stakeholders. Are we honest? Are we accountable with the power we exercise?
Sure.
So for me, those are the critical pillars.
Sure. So I have a question from a Chugo Ayaji, and it's an interesting question. I believe it's a she. While capacity building is important, what does it profit a nation to train more corrupt individuals? So looking at Ghana before and after J.J. Rawlings's reforms, do you think Nigeria also needs a clean house approach to strengthen public institutions rather than focusing primarily on capacity building?
All right, thank you very much. Recall that earlier in this conversation, we admitted that capacity gap is as important as dealing with corruption and the root of corruption. We admitted that much. Is that correct?
Yes.
We admitted that much. And so we cannot deal with the issue of capacity gap in isolation with the issue of corruption. The same way we cannot deal with the issue of corruption in isolation with the issue of capacity gap. Both can be dealt with, at the same time. So for me, we will deal with the issue of capacity gap, we'll deal with the issue of corruption, and we'll deal with the issue of the structure of public institutions in Nigeria and Africa as a whole. All must be dealt with simultaneously, and it can be dealt with simultaneously. And so when we talk about, reforms, we're saying, look, let reforms be built on certain pillars. One is, how do we build the capacity of those who operate our public institutions? How do we put the right framework so that decisions will be fair, just, and that organizations will be efficient and effective? How do we build institutions, make them robust enough to incentivize bad behavior and incentivize good behavior? How do we ensure that operators of the system are honest, ethical? I think I like to use the broader word ethical than honest. Honest is just one element of being ethical. Now, these are systems that can be built. Then the issue of, the culture of collaboration is also key. So that would be my approach to that.
Okay, and let me just say, because of the point she raised about, the clean house approach, let me give an opinion that I'm not sure that that's the right approach. The death sentence has never really stopped anybody from being corrupt. People pick pockets where folks are being executed for picking pockets. So, we need to look at more systemic changes than the clean house approach. But she continues with another quite interesting question. Chugo Ayaji, given that consultants often do much of the work in public institutions, but are engaged on a short-term basis, how impactful are their recommendations for long-term transformation? And she wants to understand the cost-benefit analysis of their works, dropping a report versus actually effecting change. How has that played out in your experience?
Now, you see, from my own experience, when I got to NIMASA, again, practical, I noticed that they had earlier engaged a lot of consultants that generated beautiful reports that were just put in the drawer. First observation. And so when we started our reforms in NIMASA, we called up all the reports, got another set of consultants to look at all the reports and extracted what was still relevant. Now, when we finished with that extraction and we generated a new report, the other thing we did was broad consultation. And now when we say consultation internally and externally. That's usually important. So get people to buy in. Now, again, cost benefit analysis. Civil servants, truly are not in the best position to generate an iterative reform process. The reason is that if you're in a house over a long time, you won't even see the shortcomings. So very often you bring somebody who sits with you and starts engaging with you and asks you, well, what do you think is the problem? Over time, they get you to think differently and clearly until you will set the strategic objective. This is what we want to change. We have to be very clear on what we want to change, how we want to change it, what kind of outcome we want. Then the next thing is, how do we make this sustainable? How do we embed this new culture? How do we institutionalize it? What kind of incentive system will help us institutionalize it? It may be captured in standard operating procedures, in performance and budgeting process, in the regulatory mandates. Then how do we build trust with different stakeholders? Is critical. And how do we build that adaptive capacity? So as things change, how do we get our people to change within the framework of the new objective we're pursuing?
But there's also the argument that some people make that we've got very good talent in our civil service, people who've got the qualifications as well, that the challenge is that we really don't give them the opportunity to shine. We bring in external consultants, pay them a lot of money for things that civil servants, if really challenged, if really motivated, properly incentivized, can do. From your experience, practical now, from your experience, how does that argument weigh up?
They're very correct. Now, what happens very often is that even when civil servants execute that task, even their colleagues will not trust them. They will always believe that it will serve their own ultimate interest. So the issue of trust crops up. So for me, it is really important to strike a balance. All consultants are not spirits. They work with the people in the system. So you could get the best hands in the system. For some assignments, you also get consultants for some assignments. It depends on the context and the peculiar nature of the task at hand. So Fantastic. For me, it is important you are clear about what problem you want to fix.
No, you've given me sorry about that, but you've given me a tag for my new t-shirt. Because I'm a consultant, I'm going to get a t-shirt that says I am not a spirit. I work with people.
Consultants are not spirits.
Yeah, but I've got a question here from
people in the internal system.
Yes.
And we frame what the challenge is.
Yes.
Consultants are not the ones to frame what the challenge is. They work with the people in the internal system and they collectively frame what the challenge is and where they want to be. So how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? How do we measure progress? How do we reward progress?
I have a question from an anonymous attendee, and I think it's an important question. He says, your educational background is in the medical sciences. Prior to your appointment as Director General of NIMASA, you had no experience in the maritime sector. Your appointment was a political compensation for loyalty to Rotimi Amechi. Given this background, do you honestly think you were technically fit to run the agency? I think this is an important question because it raises...
But it is. Now, one thing is clear, please. My first degree is in a medical science called hematology. After my first degree, my first master's degree is in management. My second master's degree is in another area of management called organizational behavior. My PhD, my doctorate, is in organizational behavior. There is nobody who is awarded a degree in regulation or regulatory work. You need to understand that very often regulators are those who are trained in any of the social sciences or in management sciences. So to that extent, there's no degree called a regulator. Everybody who turned out to be a regulator had a different background. Now, why my partner was political, in any case, everyone who is head of agency was appointed based on political consideration. No, there's no technical consideration in that. The reason is that there's nobody who is trained to be a regulator. You got trained on the job. The moment I was appointed, I did three important things. The first one is I attended a course in Harvard for regulators, deliberate, and I was deliberate and intentional because I realized I didn't have capacity in that area. I exposed myself. I attended a 1 or 2 months course on regulatory work in Harvard Business School. The second thing is that I decided to study, to understand what maritime regulation is all about, to be a regulator in the maritime space. And I took my time, read a lot of books, Then I got for myself mentors, those that have done it before, in the country and outside the country. Not necessarily in the maritime space, but those that have been regulators, successful regulators. Those are three key things I did to build capacity. Now, when we introduced the knowledge transfer section, I was also a student, and I emphasized it. If you read the book Strategic Management, I made it clear from point one that I'm not an expert regulator, and nobody is anyway. But that I come here to learn how to be a regulator, working with other stakeholders. And so I hope that helps understand.
It clearly answers the question. I have two very important questions here from Victor Aliko, who used to be with us at Next Year. So the first question is, in Nigeria, many political and public service leaders seem to clearly understand the country's governance challenges before assuming office. And they often articulate them even more clearly after leaving office. Yet, this clarity rarely translates into decisive action while they were in office. How can we address this governance challenge? Given that we're also running out of time, let me put in the second question, which is, as a former and potentially future governorship candidate in Rivers State, what is your position on local government autonomy in light of the significant capacity constraints at the state level and even deeper gaps at the local government level? Do you believe autonomy is feasible and sustainable for Nigeria's governance systems? So those are the two questions. The first one is the gap between an understanding of what the governance challenges are and the ability to implement whilst in office.
All right, thank you very much. Now, on the first question, the institutional structure could be an inhibition. So you understand the challenges, you land on the seat, you discover that the way the institution is structured, the rules, the regulations, inhibits you from performing. And I will share just one example. If you have to buy a nut to get a door to work, to get a vehicle to work, you need to buy a nut that is 5 naira. You could simply just walk to the market and buy a nut. But the Procurement Act inhibits you from doing that. And so if you do advert, whether it's local advert, meaning advert within the agency, like placing on notice board, I think the best advert on notice board, you take like minimum 7 or 10 days. Then you go to the procurement cycle. By the time you go to the procurement cycle, it's 30 days. Meanwhile, if a car can be fixed almost immediately. So that guy is not fixed for 30 days. More things get bad. You fix the knot that was bad initially. More things get bad. You go through another cycle. That guy eventually is condemned. So it's not like you don't know how a car can be fixed. So, but the institutional structure, instead of being a facilitator, becomes an inhibition from performance. Now, two is that you also have supervisory structure. Now, the oversight structure could be a challenge. And all of that has to do with the governance structure, the framework. Now, the other one is that you may also discover the institutional gaps because you can't initiate a process, and that process ends with you. There are other players, but when those players don't have the capacity to advance what you believe in, you may be bullish, but there's a limit of which you can be bullish. So it takes us to the issue of capacity gap. Now, the other one is the issue of political interference. You start a process, the appointing authority, and in any case, the way it is, you don't have enough autonomy or enough independence to make certain decisions and stand by it. The appointing authority calls you and says, listen, well, we don't believe in the way you're going. Maybe the only way you're president of the country or the government, you can make a significant change without interference. If you're not fighting with your state assembly, or if your state assembly is not controlled by someone in Abuja or someone somewhere. So you have structures to deal with. The way organizations are structured. You have the issue of the fact that, listen, you might have capacity gaps. Your people don't have the capacity to execute. You might have the issue of political interference. Now, you could also have the issue of stakeholders, powerful stakeholders, powerful networks. Then you might have your own personal failings. So there are many reasons why a leader may clearly articulate what will give us the best outcome, but the online in the seat is not able to execute them. On the issue of local government autonomy, I believe in local government autonomy. I understand the issue of capacity gap. I understand the issue of the fact that the legislative oversight that you're supposed to have at the local government level is too weak. And so that is an incentive for the members of the executive arm of local government to be corrupt. If you have councillors, they literally do not understand their mandate of understanding laws and how to enforce laws and how to enforce regulations and how to oversight the executive. And so, as we, as we agitate for local government autonomy, let's also be intentional about building capacity there. But most importantly, what are the qualities that we should look at in those who elect councillors and local government chairmen? Operatives are as important as the kind of institutions we have. It is important that we have institutions, but beyond the institutions, it's not just enough. The institution is not enough. What are the structures to promote transparency, accountability? What are the structures we are putting in place to build capacity, to get the right persons to man these institutions? So we must have a balance between the quality of our institutions and those who man our institutions and their capacity to man institutions.
Fantastic, fantastic. I have another question from a Joshua Gogo. He says he can't wait to read the book, but beyond the federal character constraints that we discussed, constraints on institutional objectives, mandates at NIMASA, how were you able to balance the institution's objectives versus the interest of NIMASA's career bureaucracy, political principles, i.e. the executive and the legislature, and the maritime and other interest groups? And what was the cost of this balancing to the institution?
That's true. We identify the issue of political interference that is real and present. We said so earlier. And
yes.
If you have good understanding of how the political networks work, and if you're lucky to be backed by those who are not driven by the corrupt spirit, it makes it a lot more easy. Now, in the case of NIMASA, I was lucky that the appointing authorities, in this case the presidency and the then Minister of Transport, were not driven by corruption. So I had reasonable back. Now on the stakeholders, other stakeholders, it requires a bit of courage, it requires a bit of understanding, it requires a bit of getting them to understand your strategic objective that is not driven by self-interest, it's driven by national interest and citizens' interest. If we're able to communicate this thing clearly, get them to understand the intention, the motive, the driving factors, chances are high that they will align with you, even when the tendency is for them to mine the system and benefit from the system. But you see, those who are driving the system, the political leadership, is also important that your intentions are clear, that you communicate transparently and honestly. Now, on the issue of the bureaucracy itself, if they understand that the reforms will serve their long-term interests, they are most likely to align. Short-termism, what I call short-termism, will only benefit a few, will not benefit the critical mass. And so if in your communication, you get the critical mass to understand that a long-term perspective will benefit everybody, but a short-term perspective will benefit a tiny clique, you will develop a critical mass that will support the changes you are trying to embed in the system. So that's what we did. Now we created structures for that. We have monthly meetings with all staff of NIMASA, getting to understand where we're going at part-time. We have meetings with heads of department, and we insist that they go and cascade it. So apart from the monthly general meeting, departments have their own meetings. We have meetings with heads of department, and we insist that they must cascade it, give us evidence that they cascade the communication with those benefits. They also observe fair decisions, objective decisions that are just for everyone, things that will serve long-term interests. And for me, those were key pillars that were like.
Let me see how many more questions we get in the last 4 minutes that I have with you. In one of your books, you had a chapter titled "China's Leadership Playbook and Nigeria's Reality." Yeah, China has achieved quite a dramatic institutional transformation. Many would attribute it to the autocracy and so on. But Africa, it seems to be stuck between this third way where democracy is not quite developed, to drive the kinds of outcomes we desire. And we don't have development, that is solving the problems that we have as a people. So my question is, are we stuck in this, land of the almost dead and not dead? Or is there a way you see that we can model through where we are today and get to an El Dorado? And if there is, what does that look like?
All right, now I want us to understand China in context. One thing you cannot take away from China is their leadership recruitment process. Now, for you to get to the peak of the leadership, you go through a tedious process. And each time you build capacity until you get to the peak. That's one. Now, two is the issue of strategic agenda, a long-term agenda. Three is the fact that China has strong institutions and that there may be changes in political leadership, but those institutions are able to absorb differences, shocks, and all of that. That's three. I've talked about the fact that the leadership recruitment process, they have a strategic agenda, a long-term agenda. Now, I've talked about the fact that, in addition to that, they also have built strong institutions. So enforcement of rules, laws, regulations is already taken for granted. Now, China may not be open to the war, but they are open to the citizens. Citizens, they build trust with the leadership. Citizens can trust the leadership, and their leadership is accountable. They may not necessarily be liberal Democrats in the Western context, but they are Democrats in accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness. And these are the same factors that if any nation put this in place, they are most likely going to prosper. So when we have, when we have a proper leadership recruitment process, when we strengthen institutions, make institutions resilient, when we have a long-term agenda that is shared by most citizens, when we have institutions, that are resilient, then we're on the path of prosperity. But when these things are absent, that's the challenge we face in Africa.
I hear you. I hear you. And in the last one, yeah.
Well, no trouble leadership. We don't have institutions that are solid, strong enough. Somebody alluded to the fact that it is not about having strong personalities or strong leaders. It's more important to have strong institutions and resilient institutions. That's something that seems to be lacking in most African countries. Do we respect rules? You know, if you talk about electoral manipulation, it's because of the fact that we don't respect rules. No, the electoral management body, is subject to manipulation. And so let's build institutions that are resilient. Let's have systems, that are accountable, transparent, that are trusted, fair, just. Let's enforce rules. Then let's recruit leaders that have both competence and character. Then we'll be on a track to progress.
Second to last question. What keeps you going? You left NIMASA 5 years ago. You've been writing. I mean, I read you almost every week. Probably one of the most syndicated columnists in Nigeria. What keeps you going? Why do you keep writing? Why do you keep engaging in this deep introspection around Nigeria? What gives you the hope? What sustains your hope? That this will work?
Three things.
Yeah.
Three things. One is that I'm an incurable optimist. I believe in Nigeria. I believe we've got the potential. I believe that God has endowed us with everything good. But unfortunately, we are not where we are supposed to be for many reasons, including the fact of leadership, not lack of ideas, not lack of resources. That's one. Now, two, I believe that nobody from outside our country can truly fix this country. We are the instruments that can fix this country. And that if each of us play our little role in our small corners, over time, we'll build a critical mass of those that can fix the country. I want to be part of those involved in that process of building a critical mass of change agents that will build the country. That's the second thing. The third thing is that I want to have what I will tell the next generation as my contribution to nation building. Let it not be that I did nothing when the country was going south, that I contributed my own part. Whether it made significant difference or not is a different matter. That keeps me going.
Fantastic. I will take that. And then let me just give it back to you. Final word, is there something that you really wanted to talk about that we didn't cover in the questions, and then you can just wrap it up with your final statement.
All right. What I can say is that if you had the opportunity of reading my book, Leading in a Storm, I talked about leading in environments of uncertainty, complexity, unpredictability, and Nigeria is a metaphor for a nation that is both complex and characterized by uncertainty. And that if leaders will succeed, they must have a different mindset. And that until we develop a new mindset towards leadership, we may not likely make any significant difference. Please, can we start by having a new mindset towards public service, towards nation building, and it begins with the individual.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for today's episode of Development Discourse. Big ideas, important questions, real conversations. I'm excited about the next two conversations I'm going to have, to wrap up the year. The next one next week is with Ada Osakwe, who has taken Nigerian food and just expanding into United States. And the one the week after is with Dike Chukwumerije on the world we want to live in. And until next time, I'm Patrick Okibo. Keep Let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much, Dakuku Peterside.
Thank you very much, Patrick Okigbo, the thought.
Thank you, sir.